The first lesson for subquarter C is test of hypotheses. Let's first define what is hypothesis testing, or in some other books it is statistical hypothesis testing. So hypothesis testing is defined as a technique used to compare two datasets or a sample from a dataset to form a valuable conclusion. Or in other words, let's say you have two given variables and then you want to check if they have a significant effect on each other, or a significant relationship, or a significant difference between the two. So we do hypothesis testing for us to come up with a valid and reliable conclusion. So in general, when we say hypothesis testing, it is a step-by-step process wherein we have two sets of numerical values and we try to test it. And after testing, we will conclude anything that we can come up with the given numerical values. There are two types of hypotheses. The first one is the null hypothesis, and the second one is the alternative hypothesis. So when we say null hypothesis, it is usually denoted by H sub 0, or sometimes we use H sub n. Also, null hypothesis pertains that there is no significant difference, effect, or relationship between any two or more variables. Why is that null hypothesis pertains to no significance? It is because when we say null, diba, from the term itself, null, when we say null, empty, diba? That's why the parang statement incorporated with null hypothesis is there is no significant difference, effect, or relationship. And we also have to take note that when we are talking about null hypothesis, the symbol or mathematical symbol incorporated with null hypothesis is equal sign. Later on, I will just explain why do we have an equal sign, or why do we incorporate equal sign with null hypothesis. Now, let's talk about alternative hypotheses. When we say alternative hypotheses, it is denoted with H sub 1, or sometimes we use H sub A. Alternative hypothesis is also the opposite of null hypothesis, wherein if null hypothesis is there is no significant difference, effect, or relationship, in alternative hypothesis we have there is a significant difference, effect, or relationship between any two or more variables. Basta you just have to take note that alternative hypothesis will always be the opposite of your null hypothesis. And the mathematical symbol for alternative hypothesis is either a unequal symbol, a greater than symbol, or a less than inequality symbol. As you have seen in the module, there are some other parts included in this lesson, but allow me to skip those parts and I will just explain it in the next lesson po. So now that we know what is a null and alternative hypothesis, what we're going to do is we will try to identify the null and alternative hypotheses for a given word problem. But before that, kindly familiarize yourselves with these common phrases that you may encounter in the word problems that we will tackle. So let's say this is your given word problem, and from this one, we will formulate your null and alternative hypotheses. So let me read the problem first. The average baptismal cost includes 50 guests. A random sample of 32 baptismal during the past year in the National Capital Region had a mean of 53 guests and a standard deviation of 10. Is there sufficient evidence at the zero point 0.05 level of significance that the average number of guests differs from the national average? Before we formulate the null and alternative hypotheses, you have to look for any of these three statements in the given word problem. First statement could be a factual statement wherein this statement states that parang in general we believe on this parang theory or parang we believe in this statement. Tapos the second one is you try to look for a statement wherein it is a researcher's claim or parang it's the claim or parang it's the imposed parang question or an imposed guess of a certain researcher. And then the third one is if hindi available yung factual statement and the second statement is also or parang the claim of the researcher is also not available, you try to read the question itself. Kasi those statements will give you a hint on what are you going to write in your null and alternative hypotheses. Going back to this word problem, we will try to look for any of those three statements so that we can have a clue or parang we can find a hint on what are we going to write in the null and alternative hypotheses. So it's either you look for a factual statement, a researcher's claim, or anything that we can find in the question imposed in this word problem. So in this word problem, in the first statement, it says that the average baptismal cost includes 50 guests. Di ba parang it is a descriptive statement wherein parang may ini-impose siya na ito yung considered na true for this given parang topic or theme nitong word problem na to. If that is the case, you have to highlight that sentence because it will be a clue on what are or parang it will be a hint on what are you going to write in your null or null and alternative hypothesis. So that is our first hint. Next, the second statement is a random sample of 32 baptismal during the past year in the National Capital Region had a mean of 53 guests and a standard deviation of 10. We don't need that one yet because it just explains the given values in this word problem. So we will not explain it first because it will not be helpful in formulating your null and alternative hypotheses. Next, we try to read the question. Is there a sufficient evidence at the 0.05 level of significance that the average number of guests differs from the national average? So we have the term differ, diba? Going back to the common phrases that you will encounter in this given word problem, di ba yung differ is one of the clues or phrases na you have to look for in a given word problem para yun din yung magiging hint natin in writing the null and alternative hypothesis. So we already have two, the first statement and the statement in the question part. Now that we already have those clues, we can now formulate your null and alternative hypotheses. We will use H sub 0 to denote the null hypothesis and H sub 1 to denote the alternative hypothesis. Formulating the null hypothesis, diba, we define null hypothesis as something that there's no significant difference, effect, or relationship between any two given variables. Or parang generally speaking, when we say null hypothesis, there's no difference between the parang general knowledge and the one that you are testing. So, if we will formulate the null hypothesis in this given word problem, you will just consider the factual statement as true or parang the factual statement is the automatic is the null hypothesis. Diba? The factual statement in this given word problem is the average baptismal cost includes 50 guests. So that statement will be automatically our null hypothesis since parang it is considered as the general truth in this word problem. So if it is considered the general truth in this word problem, that means that this statement is the null hypothesis. Next is the alternative hypothesis. We all know that the alternative hypothesis is the opposite of the null hypothesis. So in formulating this one, we will use the second clue na nakita natin in the question part of this word problem na it states that is there sufficient evidence at 0.0 level of significance that the average number of guests differs from the national average. You can write na that the average number of guests differs from the national average as the alternative hypothesis. Pero just to relate it with the given null hypothesis na the average baptismal cost includes 50 guests, we will just negate this one wherein the concept pa din will fall under differs, the term differs. So, we can state na for the alternative hypothesis, the average baptismal cost does not include 50 guests. Ngayon, ma'am, why did you not say na it is greater than or it is less than 50 guests? Kasi po, in the given word problem, it does not state if it is greater than 50 or less than 50. Diba? It just stated na it differs from the 50 guests. So, if yung term na differs yung gagamitin natin, ang tsaka naman dito sa sentence na the average baptismal cost differs include 50 guests. Diba? Hindi siya tugma. So, you have to look for a synonymous term for differs na kumaga grammatically acceptable if you will use the statement the average baptismal cost includes 50 guests. So, what's the opposite of that one na nagfo-fall pa din tayo sa concept ng differs? Pwedeng the average baptismal cost does not include 50 guests. And formulating your null and alternative hypothesis, it can be in the form of sentence case or it can also be in the form of a mathematical statement. So how are we going to write the mathematical statement for the null and alternative hypothesis? Diba, earlier we discussed that the mathematical symbol for null hypothesis will always be an equal sign. So, given that equal sign and the value na 50 guests, we can write the null hypothesis as the population mean. We will use yung population mean is the parang standard mathematical symbol for null hypothesis or any hypothesis pala. We use the symbol for population mean. So, population mean is equal to, you always use equal sign for null hypothesis. It will never change, as in equal sign lang siya for null hypothesis. And then, you include the population mean for this given problem. Or, yung null hypothesis ninyo na in statement form or in sentence case, you just get the number in that sentence. So, in this sentence, we have 50 as the numerical value. So, our mathematical statement for null hypothesis is population mean is equal to 50. If you will ask me na, ma'am, why do we have to use equal sign for null hypothesis? It is because, diba, when we say null hypothesis, there is no significant relationship, effect, or difference for any two given variables. So, for us to signify that there is no significant difference or there is no significant relationship or there's no significant effect for a given variable, we have to use equal symbol. Kasi, diba, if we use equal symbol, equal lang sila. There's equality between the two and meaning to say they are similar. So, ibig sabihin, there's no significant difference if similar yung dalawang values mo. That's why we use equal symbol. Ngayon, ma'am, I have seen some statistical books wherein they use greater than or equal to symbol or less than or equal to symbol for null hypothesis. It is also acceptable po. Pero just to be safe and hindi din kayo ma-confuse, we will just use equal sign for all the null hypotheses that we will encounter. And then for the alternative hypothesis naman, the mathematical sentence for that is the population mean is not equal to 50 because we use the term differs and the term differs represent the unequal symbol. We will do the same thing. We will just identify the null and alternative hypothesis for this given word problem. Let me read the problem first. Powdered milk is packed in a 1 kilogram bag. An inspector from the Department of Trade and Industry, or DTI, suspects that the bags may not contain 1 kilogram. A sample of 40 bags produces a mean of 0.96 kilograms and a standard deviation of 0.12 kilogram. Is there enough evidence to conclude that the bags do not contain 1 kilogram as stated at alpha level equal to 0.05? Next is to find hints or clues for us to formulate the null and alternative hypotheses. So the first statement states that powdered milk is packed in a 1 kilogram bag. So as you can see, it is the same with the previous word problem na this statement imposes a parang factual statement or a general truth. So we consider this one as our hint. Next sentence. We have an inspector from the Department of Trade and Industry, or DTI, suspects that the bags may not contain 1 kilogram. So, parang yung inspector is the researcher. Tapos, he claims na or he suspects that the bags ng powdered milk may not contain 1 kilogram. So, from a researcher's point of view, yung sinasabi ng inspector. So, if that is the case, we also have to highlight this one. So, because this is also parang one of the clues na we have to use in formulating the null and alternative hypotheses. Next sentence just talks about the values or numerical values for this word problem. So automatically, we disregard it first, since all we have to do is formulate the null and alternative hypotheses. Let's now proceed with the question part. So for the question part, is there enough evidence to conclude that the bags do not contain 1 kilogram as stated at an alpha level equal to 0.05? You read that symbol as alpha level. So, may clue din tayo for this one, yung do not contain. Since we already have a factual statement, this factual statement can be your null hypothesis. So, the powdered milk is packed in a 1 kilogram bag. That will be our null hypothesis kasi it's the parang belief of everybody na meron kang 1 kilogram bag for every powdered milk. And the mathematical statement for the null hypothesis is the population mean is equal to 1 kilogram. Next, for the alternative hypothesis, since we have the terms or phrases na may not contain and do not contain, we will use this clues or we will use these phrases in formulating the alternative hypothesis in relation to the given null hypothesis na we will just negate it or we will just put the sentence case na the powdered milk is packed in a 1 kilogram into the concept of wala siyang 1 kilogram or it does not contain a 1 kilogram na bag. So, formulating that, we will have the powdered milk is not packed in a 1 kilogram bag. Again po, we cannot write the alternative hypothesis as parang greater than or less than 1 kilogram because it is not stated in the problem that it is greater or less than 1 kilogram. It just states that it does not contain, parang it may not contain or it do not contain a 1 kilogram na bag. And then for the mathematical statement for the alternative hypothesis is the population mean is not equal to 1 kilogram. Since we don't know if it is greater or less than, so we just use the unequal symbol. Problem, one of the Undersecretary of the Department of Labor and Employment, or DOLE, claims that the average salary of a civil engineer is 18,000 pesos. A sample of 19 civil engineers' salary has a mean of 17,350 pesos and the standard deviation of 1,230 pesos. Is there enough evidence to reject the Undersecretary's claim at an alpha equal to 0.01? Obviously, in this problem po, the first statement or the first sentence is a researcher's claim na yung undersecretary na-observe niya that the average salary of a civil engineer is 18,000 pesos. So we will use that one in formulating the hypothesis or the null and alternative hypothesis. The next sentence explains the numerical values in this word problem, and in the question part, it states that is there any enough evidence to reject? So what they want to do in this problem is just reject the claim of the undersecretary. So reject is also another parang phrase or clue in formulating the null and alternative hypothesis. So, as you can see, all you have to do is just look for terms na we can use in the null and alternative hypothesis na parang usually ang hinahanap mo lang dito is a statement wherein they are stating that this given variable is equivalent to this numerical value, or sometimes yung mga terms na synonymous to an unequal sign, yung not equal sign, o kaya naman phrases synonymous to greater than or less than na mga statements. So, yun lang siya. Ganun lang siya kadali. In this kind of problem, we don't have any parang factual statement. So, we only have a parang researcher's claim and parang hint in the question na part. So, if this will be the case, all you have to take note or parang remember that null hypothesis will always be equal to a given number of value. So, since dito ang sabi, the undersecretary claims that the average salary of a civil engineer is 18,000 pesos. We can say that this one is under null hypothesis kasi nga there's parang a statement na equivalent yung sinasabi niya na parang equal yung salary to 18,000 pesos. So, if equal sa 18,000 pesos yung salary, meron tayong equality na parang term. So, meaning to say that is under null hypothesis. So, our null hypothesis is the average salary is 18,000 pesos, or you can write it as the average salary of a civil engineer is 18,000 pesos. Either way. Then the mathematical statement for this is the population mean is equal to 18,000 pesos. And then for the alternative hypothesis, our clue is just the statement or yung phrase na to reject. So, we don't know if it is greater than or less than 18,000 pesos. So, we just use the not equal symbol, or we just negate the null hypothesis. So, doing that, the alternative hypothesis can be written as the average salary is not 18,000 pesos, or the average salary of a civil engineer is not 18,000 pesos. For the alternative hypothesis, using the mathematical statement, we will just write the population mean is not equal to 18,000 pesos. Next problem, a researcher reports that the average salary of company managers is more than 63,000 pesos. A sample of 35 company managers has a mean salary of 65,700. At an alpha level equal to 0.01, test the claim that the company managers earn more than 63,000 pesos a month. The standard deviation of the population is 5,250. For this given problem, yung first statement, if you will notice, ang term na naginamit is more than the given numerical value. So, if this will be the case, even though this is a researcher's claim, we cannot say na ito yung null hypothesis. This is not the null hypothesis kasi for the null hypothesis, equality lagi yung, we're trying to look for the equality na part. So, dahil hindi siya equal, hindi niya sinasabing equal to 63,000 yung salary ng company managers, then this this researcher's claim will be under alternative hypothesis because of the term is more than. So, ngayon, ma'am, it is also the same with the question na part na ang ginamit din pong term is more than. So, meaning to say po, yung clue na din na more than will be for alternative hypothesis. So, what are we going to do now with the null hypothesis? What are you going to do with the null hypothesis is just you just write na it is the average salary of company managers is equal to 63,000. Ngayon, ma'am, how did you formulate na the salary is equal to 63,000? Because nga po, parang rule of thumb lagi na ang null hypothesis will always be equal to a given numerical value. Okay po, lagi siyang equal. Lagi mong gagamitin yung equal to. Kasi nga po, ang kiniklaim natin for null hypothesis ay there's no significant difference or relationship or effect in any two given variable. So, para ganun yung lagi mong ma-imply so that you can imply the parang term na or parang phrase na there is no significant value or there's no significant difference, relationship, or effect, we have to use the concept of equality. That's why our null hypothesis is the average salary is 63,000 pesos, or you can write it as the average salary of company managers is 63,000 pesos. For the mathematical statement of the null hypothesis, we have population mean is equal to 63,000 pesos. Next, for the alternative hypothesis, just what like I've said earlier na yung researchers claim natin will be the ang tawag nito, basis for the alternative hypothesis na you can write it as the average salary of company managers is more than 63,000 pesos, or you can write it as the average salary is more than 63,000 pesos. Ngayon, why did we use more than and yung not the term is not 63,000 pesos? We will not use is not anymore kasi po we have the term na in the given problem na is more than. Okay po? So, if kung ano yung term na ibinigay sa word problem, then you have to use it. So, if it is stated na is more than, then you have to use in the alternative hypothesis na it should be more than the given numerical value. That's why our alternative hypothesis is more than 63,000 pesos. And for the mathematical statement, we will use alternative hypothesis as the population mean is greater than 63,000 pesos, since greater than symbolizes more than. Kindly take note po that our term is just more than and not more than or equal to 63,000 pesos. That's why our symbol is just greater than and not greater than or equal to. Or just take note na for alternative hypothesis, the inequality symbols that we are allowed to use is just greater than or less than. Yun lang. And just to show you, if the alternative hypothesis is parang states parang a directional statement na kagaya nito, more than or less than, yung null hypothesis nyo can also be written as population mean is less than or equal to 63,000 pesos. Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina na if you have seen some statistical books that does not use equal symbol only for the null hypothesis, ito yon. Yung null hypothesis natin can be written as population mean is less than or equal to 63,000 pesos. How did I come up with less than or equal to 63,000 pesos? You just negate the alternative hypothesis na since you use greater than, ano ba ang opposite ng greater than? Less than. Tapos you just add equal to kasi nga po null hypothesis represents equality. That's why ang gagamitin mo naman for null hypothesis if you want to use inequality symbols, you always have to include the equal to part para it symbolizes the null hypothesis. Pero ayun nga po, just to avoid confusion, I highly suggest na we stick with equal to symbol for all the null hypotheses that we will encounter. The average family size in the Philippines was reported as 4.25. A random sample of families in a particular state resulted in the following family sizes: 5, 6, 7, 4, 3, 8, 2, and 9. At alpha level of 0.10, is the average family size more than the national average? So for this problem, we have the factual statement na the average family size in the Philippines was reported as 4.25. So, since this is a factual statement, it symbolizes or parang it represents the null hypothesis. So this can be your null hypothesis. Or we can also write the null hypothesis as the average family size is 4.25. Then on the question part of this problem, we have the term more than. So that more than can be our clue or hint for the alternative hypothesis. So our alternative hypothesis will become the average family size is more than 4.25 since the question imposes more than na phrase. Then for the mathematical statement of our null hypothesis, it can be population mean is equal to 4.25 or a population mean is less than or equal to 4.25 since the statement for alternative hypothesis is more than. So you just negate more than, it is less than or equal to. Then the mathematical statement for alternative hypothesis is population mean is greater than 4.25 since it is stated in the sentence case of the alternative hypothesis that the average family size is more than 4.25. Last problem, the alkaline batteries of a toy car were designed to last 30 hours on average with a known population standard deviation of 2.95 hours. However, lots of customers complained that the batteries were lasting less than 30 hours. You decide to randomly sample 38 of the manufacturer's batteries whose mean life was 29.3 hours. Is there sufficient evidence at the 5% level of significance to support the claim that the mean battery life is less than 30 hours? So obviously, the first sentence is a factual statement wherein yung alkaline batteries daw were designed to last 30 hours on average. So, they believe na yung batteries na yon ay tatagal ng 30 hours. So, this means that this sentence can be a representation of our null hypothesis. So this first statement can be directly written in your null hypothesis na the alkaline batteries were designed, of a toy car were designed to last 30 hours. So that can be your null hypothesis. And for the lack of space, I will just write the mathematical statement for the null hypothesis, which is population mean is equal to 30. And then next, as you have seen in the problem, we have phrases such as less than 30 hours. So that less than 30 hours is a representation for our alternative hypothesis. So yung for alternative hypothesis naman, we can write it as the batteries were lasting less than 30 hours o kaya naman in mathematical statement, we can use it as population mean is less than 30. And then if you want to rewrite the null hypothesis using an inequality symbol, we can rewrite it as the population mean is greater than or equal to 30. And how did I come up with greater than or equal to 30? I just get the opposite of the alternative or parang inequality symbol used in the alternative hypothesis, and the opposite of less than is greater than, and I just affix yung equal to symbol for the inequality para it represents the null hypothesis. So, to conclude everything, first in analyzing or parang formulating the hypothesis, both the null and alternative hypothesis, you just have to remember na for alternative hypothesis, we always use the concept of equality. So, whatever statements are available in the word problems, you have to take note na, or you have to keep in mind na yung null hypothesis will always be in the concept of equality. So, laging is siya is equal to this given numerical values. And then, for the alternative hypothesis, you just have to look for terms synonymous to not equal to, o kaya naman greater than, o kaya naman ay less than. All the synonymous phrase for those three terms ay representation of an alternative hypothesis. So that's how are you going to construct the null and alternative hypothesis for a given word problem. Do you have any questions po ba or any clarifications regarding the formulating of the hypothesis? You have to tell it to me if you cannot understand how are you going to formulate hypothesis, kasi for the next few lessons, we will have parang a step-by-step solution na netong hypothesis testing. So, this is the first step. So, if this first step is incorrect, the following steps will be incorrect also, kasi you will base your parang conclusions, or you will base your answers in the following steps in this hypothesis. Kaya po, you have to tell me if you don't understand, o kaya naman ay you are struggling, or kaya naman ay may confusion pa. Okay po?